Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, welcome. I am Libby. I'm going to be running you through the 50 books that I read in 2020. I've been asked to speak about books more, which I'm so happy to do. Like, I absolutely love reading, love books. I'm going to qualify this video with I don't study literature. A lot of what I say is going to be based on like how I felt about a book, and hopefully it will give you some ideas for sort of books that you might like to read. So on that note, let's get into the video. I'm going to take you chronologically through the books that I read throughout the year, and also I did listen to a few of them on audiobook. I think I listened to about 8 on audiobook, so if you want to be pedantic, I only actually read 42 books, but doesn't sound as good. So the first book of 2020 that I read was My Sister the Serial Killer. So it's set in Nigeria and it's about 2 sisters, one of whom keeps killing her husbands, and then her sister has to sort of help her clean it up and pick up all the pieces afterwards. I really enjoyed this one. It was really fast paced. So the next one that I read was The Nine-Chambered Heart, which was about one woman from 9 different people's narrative perspectives, which I thought was such an interesting idea, which is what made me pick it up in the first place. I hadn't heard of it before, I just read the blurb. Beginning of it I definitely remember preferring to the end, but I think I would still recommend it. I only gave it 3 stars on Goodreads, but I did enjoy this one. The next book that I read was How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram x Kendi. I remember reading this at the beginning of first year. I would highly recommend reading this, and I think sort of the term anti-racism and the fact that it's not enough to be not racist, you have to be actively anti-racist, is very much a sentiment that has been at the heart of the BLM movement, and I think this book explores a lot of that and a lot of like history and things I didn't know about. Like, I learned a lot from this book. The next book that I read was The Ministry of Utmost Happiness by Arundhati Roy. So she wrote The God of Small Things, which won the Man Booker. I did enjoy this one, I think. I don't remember it a huge deal, but I do remember enjoying it. I've given it 4 stars on Goodreads. It covers a lot in here, and I really like to sort of like learn things from a book, or like learn to empathise with a different sort of perspective or something that I've not necessarily heard about before, and there was definitely a lot of that in here, so I would definitely recommend reading this one. The next book I read was The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemison, which is fantasy novel, so it's the 3rd one in the series. The 5th season is the first one, and I only gave this 3 stars, which I actually think is quite harsh, but I didn't think that I would like fantasy that much. Like, I don't think I'm that much of a fantasy person, but I feel like I was converted a little bit by this, and like the ones that I've read previously. I've read the whole trilogy now because the themes in it is like, the world is so believable, you get so immersed in it. It's got like really interesting themes, like very much like relevant themes even though it's fantasy. It's so well written, and like the world is so realistic. Like, I would read them again. Like, I really got lost in them, so I loved them. And there's like shocking bits. It's just great. Like, I loved these books. Would highly recommend them. I don't know why I've only given it 3 stars. I think probably because it didn't live up to the other ones for me, but retrospectively I think I was probably being a bit harsh. The next book that I read was by Hilary Mantel, which was The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher. So I'm sure you've all heard of Hilary Mantel because she wrote Wolf Hall, but this is a collection of short stories because apparently that's quite hard to keep up with the characters, so I thought I'd try out this book because I think I saw it in a charity shop, so I thought I would pick it up. So these are quite dark stories, like depressing with some dark humour in there, but I definitely really enjoyed reading these. And I also actually liked the format of short stories in this book because I've tried and failed to read a book of short stories before, and I thought perhaps I don't like that format, but this proved that wrong, so would definitely recommend. And I do believe I have Wolf Hall at uni, so I will be reading that at some point soon. The next book that I read, which I really didn't like, but again take this with a pinch of salt, was Stephen King's Misery. So I don't know if perhaps horror isn't for me like as a genre, but I really didn't think this was very good. I didn't really like believe or like the characters. I wasn't scared. Yeah, I just didn't love it. The next one that I read was The Sellout by Paul Beatty. So this is like a satirical sort of like absurd book about, I believe it's about sort of like resegregating a school, like darkly humorous, and it's very sort of like hyperbolic. There definitely were some references that I didn't get, American references in there, and like a little bit of historical stuff that perhaps was a bit lost on me, but I did really enjoy this one, and it won the Man Booker in 2016. The next book I read I think is very much like a modern classic. Like, I've seen it and thinking like Normal People. I've heard a lot of people say that it's like something that you should definitely read. I didn't love this one. I don't know why. Like, I know a lot of people really like this one, but yeah, it's set in like a boarding school, so if you like the sort of like all like school vibes in a book, you'll probably enjoy this. The next book that I read is The Gendered Brain. I found this really interesting. I feel like I definitely held the belief that there were no meaningful differences between the male and female brain anyway, but to read this really like affirmed that, so I would highly recommend reading this. The next thing that I read, which I actually don't have the book for because I read it on my Kindle, was This Is Going to Hurt by Adam Kay. It's the Diaries of a Junior Doctor, so it's literally like him taking you through sort of like his experience as a junior doctor, about some of the patients that he's had and things like that. So it was quite funny, it was very easy to read. So the next thing that I read is a classic, which is Jane Eyre. I actually really enjoyed this. Again, this was a bit of a shock to me because I didn't think this would be my sort of book, but it's got some romance in there. Obviously it's of its time, it has some problematic things in there, but yeah, I actually really enjoyed this one, so it's a classic that I definitely would recommend. The next thing that I read was Who Killed My Father. It's very small, I think it's about 100 pages. It's actually like a long essay. This one has really stayed with me. So it's basically autobiographical, how government policy literally impacted his father's life and culminated in his father's death. Really captivated me. I found it so interesting. I learned from it. I would highly recommend it, and it won't take more than like 1 or 2 evenings to read. The next thing that I read was The 4-Hour Workweek. So this is kind of like a self-helpy, like career, that sort of book, and honestly, like, I didn't love it. I found it a little bit cliched. I didn't necessarily agree with some of the stuff that was in here. Some of it was interesting, like I took some interesting things away from it. It's basically how you can sort of like spend less time working, increase your productivity, take a step back from work, maximize efficiency, and like sort of set up businesses and that sort of thing. But I'm personally not a huge fan of like this genre of books anyway, so again, take what I say with a pinch of salt. The next thing I read I also don't have because I got this on my Kindle, which was Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. So again, this is a really popular one, and I know a lot of people love this. It's like a dystopian novel. The world's basically gone to like a wasteland. Everyone's on the same computer system and you basically like live in this VR world, and I think it's like an egg and you have to like find the egg. You win the main guy's fortune. So I might have explained that awfully. Basically like the premise of the book, but I didn't love it. I think perhaps again this is because I don't like that genre. I don't think I loved how it was written either, so yeah, it just really wasn't for me. The next thing I read, which I actually listened to, was Educated by Tara Westover, which I absolutely love. So it's autobiographical and it's about Tara Westover. She was born to a family who didn't send their children to school in America. Her father sort of was preparing for the end of the world, and she was 17 or she went to formal education, but she basically taught herself a lot of stuff at home, and then she ends up going to Harvard and Cambridge, and it's all about like everything that she learns along the way and just sort of like following her account and her relationships with her family, which I found so interesting. Like, I really enjoyed listening to it. The next thing that I read, which is probably going to be another unpopular opinion, is Shantaram, which I did not like at all. I really didn't like this one. I didn't think it was amazingly well written. I didn't love the main character. I thought some of the characterizations were problematic. It's basically following Gregory David Roberts when he escapes from an Australian prison to India, where he lives in a Bombay slum. It was really repetitive for me, and it was full of sort of like pseudo philosophy. The next thing I read was The Wide Sargasso Sea, a response to Jane Eyre, and it offers a different like narrative perspective, so I thought this was really worth reading. The next thing that I read was Murmur by Will Eves. So this one is about Alan Turing, who was chemically castrated after his efforts in the war, and it's sort of all about that. I thought this one was really well written. Some of it is like a little bit dreamlike and confusing, but I think that is reflective of like the state of the narrator. Yeah, I would definitely recommend reading this one. The next book that I read was Sula by Toni Morrison. I really enjoyed this one, and if you haven't read any Toni Morrison, I would highly recommend. The next book I read was The End of Eddie by Edouard Louis. So this is more a story about his childhood. He's the one that wrote Who Killed My Father. This one's a little bit longer. I didn't love this one as much, but still appreciated and enjoyed it. The next thing that I read was probably like one of my favourite books of all time, which I don't have with me, was Becoming by Michelle Obama, and I honestly, like, I loved it. I actually listened to this one on an audiobook, but I do have the physical copy as well. It's basically just sort of like the story of her life, and she writes so beautifully. The next thing I read, which I also don't have with me, was Silke's Journey, which is like the second one to The Tattooist of Auschwitz. The next thing I read was basically just like a long essay, We Should All Be Feminists, which I enjoyed. I didn't enjoy it as much as all of her other books that I've read. I didn't find it amazingly groundbreaking, but would still recommend. Still really interesting to read. The next thing I read, which is actually the second time I've read this, is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, which I read this for the first time a couple of years ago, probably maybe like 3 or 4 years ago now, in 2017 I want to say. And when the Black Lives Matter movement sort of came to light so much again, I thought I would reread it and sort of refresh my mind. So this is very much from like a UK perspective, whereas How to Be an Anti-Racist was from a very much American perspective. So there's a lot of Black British history that you may not necessarily have been aware of. I definitely wasn't aware of. The next thing that I read was Girl, Woman, Other, which won the Man Booker in 2019. I'm sure you've seen a lot of this, but I loved it as much as everyone else did. Follows a lot of different narratives, covers a lot of different sort of like narrative perspectives, and I think it does it so well and sort of like ties them all together. This one is largely set in England as well, if I remember rightly. The next one that I read, I actually listened to again, was Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama, which is sort of like an account of his younger life, which I think he wrote quite a few years ago now, which I definitely enjoyed. I actually liked listening to it because he narrated it as well. The next book that I read was Lincoln in the Bardo, which is about Lincoln's son when he's ill, and he's sort of trapped in like a transitional realm between life and death, and it's got sort of like ghosts, and it won the Man Booker Prize in 2017, and I did enjoy this one. The next one that I read was There by Tommy Orange, which is about a powwow, lots of different characters, stories, and how they all end up at this powwow in Oakland, and it follows a lot of different Native American characters. The next book that I read was My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Basically ends up sort of like taking a year of rest and relaxation, which means taking like a lot of drugs. I didn't love this one. It just wasn't my favourite. I don't think I really liked the character. I don't think she was meant to be particularly likeable, but yeah, this one wasn't personally for me. The next one I read was I Know Why the Caged Birds Sing by Maya Angelou, which you've probably all heard of. This was amazing. I really enjoyed it. It's basically about, this is like her early childhood, and it's the beginning of those volumes. Would highly recommend reading this. It's the American South of the 1930s. The next book I read was Capitalist Realism, which is basically like about capitalism, and I think it's sort of how capitalism is presented as that there's no other option. Found that an interesting read. The next one that I read was The Wall, which is basically like how a country is surrounded by a wall, and everyone has to do like military service on the wall, and people sort of like try and get in through the wall, which obviously has themes of like immigration, things like that. I didn't love how this one was written. I think the themes were interesting, but it wasn't my favourite. The next one that I read was Hunger by Roxane Gay, and this is a memoir about exploring what it means to be overweight in a time when the bigger you are, the less you are seen. Speaks about like an act of violence that really changed her life. The next one I read was Queenie, which has been really popular, but again, this wasn't my absolute favourite, but that again I think is because of the style and genre that isn't my favourite. The next one I listened to again was The Good Immigrant, which is a set of stories about immigration to the UK and sort of living in the UK as an immigrant. Definitely really enjoyed listening to that one. A lot of the people that have written in there are famous, like actors or comedians and things like that. The next one that I read was The Scarlet Letter, which is another classic. Thought I would give it a read. I'm kind of neutral about this one. It was okay. It's about Hester, who is imprisoned and publicly shamed and forced to wear a scarlet A for committing adultery and bearing a legitimate child. The next one I read is Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid, which is a very popular book again, and it's about Amira. She is apprehended at the supermarket for kidnapping the white child she's actually babysitting, which sets off an explosive chain of events. I didn't love the way that this was written, but this is a style thing again, because I don't really like it when books have like text speak and things like that in there. I personally don't love that in a book, but it was definitely a very good book, had very interesting themes, and it's very popular, so I think a lot of people would like it. The next one I read was Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Americana, which is I think her most popular book. I have read a lot of things that she's written. Half of the Yellow Sun is one of my favourite books of all time. She's an amazing writer and I would highly recommend reading whatever she writes, to be honest. The next one I read is Her Body and Other Parties, which is a collection of short stories. Again, this is a very sort of dark set of short stories with horror, fantasy, fabulism, magical realism. I really enjoyed this, would definitely recommend it. The next one that I read was Everyday Sexism by Laura Bates, which I believe is like a project that she started with women being able to come forward on Twitter, I think, with like experience of everyday sexism. I think a lot of it was quite familiar to me because I've done sort of like criminal law and I've read a lot about it either in my own time or through the law course. But I still found it really interesting and it sort of really opened my eyes to how everyday sexism like is so common, and a lot of it you don't really give a second thought to. So I would highly recommend reading this. It was quite sad though for me. The next one I read by Sally Rooney was Conversations with Friends. She's the one that wrote Normal People. It is following a couple of friends from Dublin and sort of like their relationship with an older couple. It wasn't anything sort of revolutionary for me, but it was quite an enjoyable read. The next one I read was Superior by Angela Saini, which is about the return of race science, which I also listened to her do a talk on, about where the idea of race came from, what it means, and how it's not actually really biologically significant, and race is very much like a made-up human concept, that sort of thing. Some history, obviously science as well. Yeah, I found this one really interesting. I learned a lot from this. The next one I read was Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, which is really popular. It's basically all about his story, like founding Nike and his like struggles with it and all of that. I didn't love it, but again, we've established I don't love that genre. The next one that I read I've left at uni, which was The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which is about two sisters who come from a town called Mallard where everyone is white passing. They're twins and one of them goes on to sort of live secretly passing as white, and the other sister ends up coming back to the small community, and it's all about sort of their stories. I really enjoyed that one. Again, it's a very popular book. The next one I read, which I listened to again, was Brit-ish on Race, Identity and Belonging by Afua Hirsch, which is sort of like her story with finding her identity and being black and British. Her parents are British. She was raised, educated, socialised in Britain. Her partner, daughter, sister and the vast majority of her friends are British, so why is her identity and sense of belonging a subject of debate? The reason is simply because of the colour of her skin. I really enjoyed listening to this one, and I believe it was narrated by her as well. A very important read. I would definitely highly recommend reading that one as well. The next one that I read was Little Fires Everywhere, which is about two families set in America. A family adopt a baby, biological mother sort of comes around, following that sort of story, the court case, and exploring all of those sorts of themes. The next one I read was Autumn by Ali Smith, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker in 2017. So this one is very centred around Brexit. News stories that did happen during Brexit and after Brexit are actually included in the plot of this book. I thought it was really well written. Some of it's quite like dreamlike, but yeah, I actually really enjoyed this one. The next one that I read was The History of Violence by Edouard Louis, which is again autobiographical, about a Christmas Eve when he met a man, pulled out a gun on him, raped him and said that he was going to kill him. It retraces the story of that night. It looks at immigration, dispossession, racism, effects of trauma. So this one was narrated by his sister. A lot of it was him listening to his sister describe the events that he had described to her, which I didn't love because she's not presented as very likeable. So the stuff that she comments on it is kind of a little bit jarring, and I think that's probably the whole point, but I didn't love it for that reason. Obviously trigger warning as well in there. There definitely were bits in here that I thought were really good, really powerful, but it was more when he was commenting on things himself, and that was for me too few and far between. And the last book that I read was The Little Black Book, which is a toolkit for working women. So I didn't learn a huge deal from this, but some of it was really helpful. So that is all the books that I read in 2020, and I have been filming for a really long time. I really hope you've enjoyed the video, and thank you for sticking around if you've made it to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.